Hey folks, welcome to Road Hard Restoration's YouTube channel. I'm Steve, and in this video I'm going to give you a step-by-step guide on getting your car ready for paint. From stripping it down to bare metal to final primer. This is for the first-time DIYer, weekend warrior that wants to repaint their old car or truck. So this video is not going to be so much a hands-on. This is going to be more of a blueprint showing you step-by-step what you need to do to get your car ready for paint. I'll also put markers on the video, so when you're at that stage you can go back and refer to it. So some of the questions that I see on the forums is very basic stuff like, what grit sandpaper do I use and when? When do I use what primer? How many coats? You know, all that sort of thing. So please hit that subscribe button. Let's get into it. So the first step when you want to paint your car is you got to clean it. So I have some Dawn dish soap, some Comet, you can use Ajax, and a red Scotch-Brite. Now wash the car. You want to get all of the dirt, grease, grime off of there so you're not grinding it into the paint, you're not grinding it into the metal. Before I do anything with the car, before I pull it into the shop, I simply just give it a bath. So that's the first step, is to clean it. All right, so you got the car cleaned in the driveway, garage, under the carport, wherever you're building your car, and next thing you do is clean it again. Yes, I know that seems excessive, but I like to make sure everything's clean. Two things, I use a water-based and a solvent-based cleaner. I'm out of the water-based. I gotta get some more of that. In a pinch, you can use this kind of foamy glass cleaner. This actually works fairly well, but it's a little pricey to do the whole car like that. So wipe it down, and then I wipe it down again with a grease and wax remover. This is from Clean Strip. It's called Prep All Wax and Grease Remover. Now I would recommend, if you can afford it, go with the grease and wax remover and the water-based cleaner from the manufacturer of the paint line that you're using. It's always a good idea to stay within the same brand with all of these chemical products. That way you know everything is going to play nice with each other. You can also ask your jobber what guys in the area are using that they don't have issues with, because you know if they have an issue, they will go back to the jobber and say, hey, this product that you sold me to work with this paint is giving me all sorts of problems. So the local jobber should know, you know, what's going to work with the products that they carry. When I'm using these products here, I use these Torx wipes. It's just paper towel, but it's the blue paper towel. This particular one is actually 4-ply, and because I'm frugal, I actually open these up and split them in half. So I have two ply. So I have twice as much surface area. I fold it in quarters, spray it on the panel, wipe it off, turn it over, spray it again, and wipe it off. Then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 surfaces there. And then I flip it over, do the same thing. I have 4 more surfaces to wipe on. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to just smear the contamination all over the panel. You want to turn your rag over frequently and not back over again on the surface that you just wiped with. It doesn't matter if they get wet, it's going to be in the paper. You can use a white paper towel, like a brawny or something, but just check it that it's not leaving a bunch of white fibers everywhere. All right, something I forgot to mention when you are cleaning the vehicle after the initial wash, anytime you're wiping down the panel between any steps, and I recommend wiping it down between each step to get any dust off of there, any additional contaminants, especially if it's been sitting. You know, you have people walking around going like, oh, let me touch your panel. And then they get their oily fingerprints on the car. So I wipe it off before I do go into each next step. But anytime I'm working on the car after the initial wash, I don't ever touch the car without gloves. That's just me. I mean, you just got to make sure you clean it off really good after you're done. Plus, it also helps keep your hands from getting all that chemicals in them. I use these SAS gloves, large. It's a 7mm nitrile glove. I just get these off of Amazon as well. But these are the Ravens. I've been using these for years and years, and I keep several boxes in stock. All right, now you got the car washed, you got the car pulled in. I like to take everything apart. If you're repainting your car, don't cut corners and pull the mirrors, pull the handles, pull all the trim that you can, and then even pull the trim that you can't, because you're just going to get a much better quality looking paint job if you detrim the car. So moldings, mirrors, door handles, door lock cylinders, windshield wipers, the trim around the windows. You have side marker lights, wheel opening moldings, rocker trim, you name it. Take it all off. So the only thing you're left with is what you're painting. Less masking, less possible overspray, and less points of failure at the masking edge when you're masking around these things, okay? You can make a great paint job look like crap when you have a whole bunch of masking lines, okay? That's a big, big red flag when I see a car at a car show and there's masking tape lines around all the handles, because then I know it was a cheap paint job. So even if you're using the least quality paint, doing it yourself for the first time, if the masking is done properly and it's detrimmed properly, it's going to look amazing. All right, so the next step after you got the car cleaned is to strip it down to bare metal. First question is, do you need to strip it down to bare metal? Most of the time, I would say yes. If you're dealing with a car from the 60s or 70s or older, or even sometimes in the 80s, it's always best to know what you're working with. If you know that it's the absolutely original paint, well, all you're dealing with is the paint and the primer, so it's not going to take you much to really sand it down to bare metal. So you might as well do that. If the paint's checking, if it's peeling, if it's, you're probably going to have, some rust or patina, you're going to want to sand it down anyway. So don't take a shortcut by just painting over the unknown. So that being said, if you have a car that's had several paint jobs on it, or you don't know what kind of paint it is, it could be an old lacquer paint. It may not play nice with the newer paints and give you problems. So, unless your car was already sanded down to bare metal at one point, like back in the 2000s or something, and repainted with a base clear, and you're just wanting to freshen up the paint job or, change the color on it or something, yeah, you can get away with just sanding it down, prepping it properly, and then repainting over it. Not a problem. That's going to be outside the scope of this video. This video is about, ground up, bare metal to ready for paint. So, different methods of stripping the car. You can mechanically strip it with some of the sanders like you have here. You can chemically strip it with paint stripper. You can have it sandblasted or media blasted. You can have it chemically dipped. So those last two, again, is outside the scope of this video. This is for the first timer, DIY, or whatever. So first thing is paint stripper. There's a couple here. There's been a lot of complaints about the paint strippers nowadays not working correctly as well as they used to. That may or may not be true. I really don't have any problem with the paint strippers working. People say, oh, that doesn't work at all. Well, maybe they're not using it correctly. I don't know. I know they changed the formula supposedly, but I don't know. It works for me. I just brush it on with the brush, let it do its thing, scrape it off with a scraper. Sometimes you have to use 2 applications, sometimes 3 or 4. It just kind of depends on the paint that you're stripping and how many layers. Again, always wear your gloves when you're using this stuff. It is really nasty. Make sure you have good ventilation. And if you have limited ventilation, or honestly, even if you're outside doing it, wear a respirator. And not just a dust mask, but an actual respirator. And I'll go into those here in a little bit. But yeah, it works pretty good. I'm not sure, what people's problems are with these, but it works for me. So, and this is just the stuff from the hardware store. This was handed to me recently. I haven't tried it yet. I'm actually going to do a video testing this stuff out. This is a more environmentally friendly. It says no harsh fumes. It still says to wear gloves, naturally, because even if this stuff is not going to hurt you, you're still dealing with old paint and chemicals that you're peeling off of the car. So anyway, you don't want that all over your hands. Stay tuned for this, and you'll see this in action here soon. And then that leaves us with mechanical stripping. Sandpaper. We have stripping discs. We have newfangled drums. And then we've got some big guns here. So when I'm stripping a car that has multiple layers of paint, I use a variable speed polisher with a backing pad on here that I could put a 36 or an 80 grit, 36, 40, honestly, for stripping a lot of paint. And then you can use an 80 as well, depending on what you're doing. You know, if you're stripping the original paint off of a car, just a single layer of paint and primer, just go with 80. You don't need to go so aggressive with the 36. So continuing on in this video, I will be telling you exactly what grits I recommend for which step. So if you're doing multiple layers of paint stripping, 36 grit. If they don't have 36, 40 is close enough. Once you got the paint stripped to bare metal, you don't need to grind off every little last bit of paint. If you have like little clouds of paint here and there, you don't need to grind the metal off with the 36, okay? Also, this thing will get the panel hot, and so will this. This will also get the panel hot. So you want to keep moving constantly. The 36 here is a stick-on. I'm actually switching over to the hook and loop. That's why I have two DAs here. Well, one I had in the shop and then one I had at home, so that's why I have two. But I left one with the stick-it pad, stick-and pad, whatever. So because I still have some of these left. So as I'm using up my paper here, I'm phasing them out and going with the hook and loop. What you want to do is once you have, you know, like 80 to 90% of the paint stripped off. Sometimes you might have like little, you know, splotches here and there. You'll want to go over it with 80. The last grit that you use before you prime is 80. So you want to use the 80 grit on the entire panel from edge to edge, and you want to put a nice tooth in the sheet metal. You don't want to have anything shiny. When you're using, for instance, this drum, it actually kind of polishes the metal and leaves it kind of shiny because the paints and, you know, body filler and stuff, they have two different types of adhesion. There's a mechanical and a chemical. Mechanical is the scratch. You know, they're gonna physically grab onto each other. So this guy right here is the drum sander. This one's from Harbor Freight. It's a knockoff of the Eastwood version. I did a video on this recently, so you can go check that out if you're interested in how that thing works. It's okay. It does okay. It's relatively easy to use. It does wear just like anything else, but I'll continue using it. I like it. I do like the large variable speed polisher with the sanding disc on it. Again, you don't want to go too fast with this. That's why I like the variable speed, because you can slow it down. So speed it up. It feels like it's getting too hot on the panel, you can slow it down. Again, you want to keep moving on with it. So the other way is to just go ahead and just knock it out with the DA. If that's all you got, then that's great. That'll work as well. I have 36 on here, or you can get some 80 grit. But like I said, you want to stop at 80 before you prime the car. And you definitely want to end at 80 with the sanding of the panel. You can sand it with 36 and then prime over that, but there's a chance that those scratches might, you know, show through, and you're going to be filling it with filler, and it's just unnecessary, essentially. So when you're sanding it with 80, you'll want to make sure it's nice and dull. You don't want anything shiny. Like this guy right here will actually kind of polish the metal. So regardless of the method, especially if you're using the chemical stripper, you still want to go over it with 80. Okay, I'll say it again. When you're using your chemical stripper, after you cleaned everything off, you still want to hit it with an 80 so you can put a tooth in it, so you put a scratch in it, so that way it'll give something for the primer to mechanically attach to it, okay? And you want it to be nice and uniform dullness. You don't want to see any shiny metal, okay? So I also have these guys right here. This is just a stripping disc from 3M. It's basically the same material as what you have here. It's just on a wheel. You chuck this in your drill and go to town. So I like this around like the window openings, the trunk gutters, you know, even the backside, underside of the hood or the trunk, or just other hard to reach places. And then once it gets a little small, before it's completely worn out, I stop, because it makes it a smaller diameter. In case I need to get into smaller places, I can still use it for a little bit. Don't run it all the way down to the center if you don't need to, because I like to, like I said, leave a little bit of space there, so that way at least I have a small one to use in hard to reach areas. Okay, that's a little tip. All right, so this is your DA. It's actually called an orbital sander. This is the original DA, dual action sander. It is kind of a orbital here as it kind of goes up and down as it spins. And then the dual action is you can actually turn this little knob here, and then this spins freely, as well as this right here. So it's kind of like the teacup effect, right, at Disneyland. It spins while the whole thing's spinning. So that's kind of a good way to think of it. This one's just not as ergonomic, and it's heavy and it's bulky, but this is actually good for stripping too. And because you can actually lock it, right? So it spins, put your 36 on there, and it's basically a miniature version of this. Miniature is in 6 inches versus 8 inches. And then when you turn the knob, then you have your teacup. You have your teacup here, it spins around as you're sanding, and you get your sand scratch similar to this with a random orbital position. So that's why they call it a dual action, DA. But everybody still calls these DAs. So yeah, that's stripping the car. So let's get into the next step. All right, so now you got your car stripped down to bare metal, and it's time to put a coat of primer on it. Question, what primer should you use? So there are several options. There's etch primer. There's epoxy primer, which both of these are. There are some direct to metal primers. I recommend epoxy primer. Now you can go with whatever brand you want, whatever is available in your area. You know, if you're a first-time painter, I would go with your local jobber recommendations. You know, you can base on your decision on their recommendations. They sell the product in that area. They can support it. They can support you through the process as well. So each of these products has a TDS sheet, technical data sheet. It'll tell you exactly what you can put it on top of and what you can't put it on top of. For example, this epoxy primer right here, it says it can go over sanded bare or primed steel, galvanized aluminum, sanded and cleaned body filler, SMC, gel-coated fiberglass, etc., properly sanded e-coat. It also says, do not put it over etch primer, okay? So you don't want to go ahead and spray etch primer over your whole car and then decide, you know what, I'm going to put epoxy on it. Because now you got to sand all of this off and start over. So when you choose a paint line, you know, whether it's Eastwood stuff or, you know, the inexpensive stuff from Summit, or you go to Napa and you get your Martin Senior paints or whatever, ask them for the technical data sheet. You can also Google this, get the part number of the product that they carry, plug it into Google machine, and then write TDS right after it, and it'll spit this out. And then you can see exactly what it's compatible with. So what do you put on the bare steel? Like I said, etch primer, epoxy, 2K direct to metal primers, polyester primers, surfacers. If you're stripping the whole car down to bare metal, get yourself a gallon of epoxy primer, get the hardener for it. This one actually has a reducer, which is a third part. Sometimes it's optional. Check your TDS sheets and confirm what your product line uses. Always check your TDS sheets. It'll tell you what size gun it recommends, what pressure, how many coats, how long between coats, how long before you can recoat it, how long until you can sand it, on and on and on. It is all in here. If you can, stick with the same product line. You know, if you're going to go with the BASF, Limco, stick with the Limco line. Same thing like I mentioned earlier with the cleaners. If you can afford the BASF cleaner for your BASF products, or if you can afford the PPG cleaners for your PPG products, go for it. It is very expensive, the cleaners for those particular brands. I don't know why. So I go with this stuff, works great. So if you strip the whole entire car in one go, you want to prime it as soon as possible, especially if you're in a wet climate. I'm in Arizona where it's relatively dry most of the time. I have a couple doors down here in the back that I stripped down like a year and a half, 2 years ago to bare steel. Now the back side's all primed, but the surface of the door skin is bare steel, and I have zero flash rust. So other guys, it'll be flash rusting in a week. So it just kind of depends on your climate. But generally, you want to prime it as soon as possible. So if you're doing the whole car, then you can mix up, a whole cup, and mix up your whole cup and then spray it. I recommend these disposable cups. I did a video on this recently, so go check that out. I really like this system, especially for the home painter, because just the cleanup and everything else is just so much easier to deal with. If you're doing the car panel by panel, I don't know if, this is from Harbor Freight, I don't know if Harbor Freight sells the smaller ones. This one's actually a 3M cup, but I know you can still order generic ones on Amazon, and I'll put a link down in the description below. I don't have experience with the Amazon ones, so order those at your own risk. I do have experience with the Harbor Freight ones, and they work just fine. I suspect they're probably all come out of the same manufacturing plant in China, so just whose label you put on it. But the small ones are great for if you're doing piece at a time. So if you're not stripping the entire car all in one go, you're just stripping the door, and then you want to mix up a little bit of primer, mix it up in a small cup, spray your primer, and then you throw the bag away or clean your gun, and then move on to the next panel the next weekend. So you do the door one weekend, another door next weekend, hood another weekend, the trunk lid, maybe a couple small pieces another weekend. Doing it that way, it's going to take you 2 months to strip and prime a car. But that's what you got to do. That's what you got to do. Some guys only have a couple hours on a weekend to work on their car. So, just make it happen. Just put in the time, put in the hours, and you'll be rewarded in the end. If you can get it all done in one shot, great. That's awesome. If you have the space to blow your car apart. A lot of guys are working out of a 2-car garage or a carport or something. You don't have room for all these panels to be off the car. So what I would recommend to do then is to remove all the panels, set them aside, strip the body of the car, and then prime just the body. You can roll it outside, put a tarp on it once everything's cured. The epoxy primer will hold up to inclement weather for a reasonable period of time, especially if it's covered. Lay your panels out in the garage or wherever your working area is, and then knock all those out, and then prime all of those. And then you can bring the car in and reassemble it, and then have everything back inside again. But I really like these little cups, like I said, for doing spot jobs, or doing like a single panel repair, or you're stripping and repriming an entire panel. Things like the doors, well, all of the bolt-on parts, basically you're going to probably wind up doing them in 2 sessions each, one for the outside and one for the inside, unless you can find out a way to hang them, where you can get access to both sides at the same time. A lot of times I use the body stands, and I just have the door sitting on it, or the fender sitting on it, or the hood, or whatever, and I can only get to one side, and then once that's cured, I turn it over, and then I do the other side. That's just kind of how it works for me in my shop, because I don't have a whole bunch of racks to hang stuff in. So I have to do 2 priming sessions to do all that kind of stuff. Primer guns. So I want to talk about the primer guns a little bit, about paint guns. I'm not going to get too in depth with these, but a lot of people ask, well, what size needle should I have? What size, what pressure of air should I be running? The epoxy is generally like 1.3 to 1.4 tip, but again, check your TDS sheets, it'll tell you. So I like, this particular one is a 1.4. I use this for my epoxy primer. I also have another needle and seat kit here. And this one is a this is a 2.1. So this is good for your filler, basically your sprayable Bondo, essentially like your feather fill, or basically a polyester primer surfacer that you spray out on the gun. So that's what this needle for. This thing is huge. It's like a fire hose, but in comparison. If you have just your basic, Harbor Freight base coat, clear coat gun, you can use that for your epoxy primer. If your epoxy primer is a little thick, check your TDS sheets. It'll tell you what you can reduce it in. So basically, like I said, if it's not spraying real well, you can thin it out a little bit with the reducer that is recommended on here. Like I said, if you're using just a really inexpensive gun from Harbor Freight or the hardware store or something, if you can, spend a little bit more money on something that has either interchangeable tips that come. Sometimes you get a kit that comes with like 3 different sets of caps and needles and tips and stuff. Sometimes you'll have like a 3-pack of guns that comes with all 3 of them. That's actually a good way to go as well. Check with your jobber, because a lot of times they have a budget line starter set that has 2 or 3 guns in it, or 1 gun and 2 or 3 different sets of tips. So that's where I would go instead of spending a whole bunch of money on a brand name gun, unless you're planning on doing this a lot. So, but just like anything else, you get what you pay for. Quality isn't going to be there on those less expensive guns. Quality and consistency is what you're going to get out of a name brand gun. This is an old school SATA KLC-B HVLP primer gun. And this one right here is a 3M plastic gun. These have actually become, I guess, pretty popular. This particular one is a 1.8 tip, so this is good for your primer surfacers. So I will get into that in a few moments, but basically, if you're spraying anything thicker, you need a bigger needle tip. So your primer sealer, you want like a 1.3 tip. Epoxy is 1.3, 1.4. Your 2K primer surfacers, 1.8. And then, your sprayable Bondo, you want like a 2.0, 2.1, somewhere in that range. Like I said, I did a video on the disposable cup system, and they sell these for pretty much any, these adapters to use the disposable paint cups for pretty much any gun. And if Harbor Freight doesn't have the one, you can go to your jobber and get the adapter. That's where I got most of mine. Next question is, can I put body filler over bare steel, or does it need to go over epoxy? The answer is yes, both, either or. Body filler has been going over bare steel ever since it was invented. Epoxy primer under the body filler is superior for corrosion protection. Collision industry, 99 times out of 100 is not going to epoxy prime before they put body filler over their repair areas. Collision guys, they're trying to move fast. They need to move fast, and it is still considered appropriate and still warranted. So it's an acceptable, repair. So no issues with putting it over bare steel. You do want to sand it at a minimum 80 grit. Ideally, even better, 36 or 40 grit for your bare steel with the filler here. It even says right here, use 40 to 80 grit disc. So anywhere in that range would be fine. You just want to make sure you have a good tooth for the filler to get that mechanical adhesion to stick to it. I'm not going to get into super detail on like how to mix Bondo and everything. This is just kind of like the basic steps in order of operations. Now there's a lot of different types of body filler. I just have 2 examples right here, or 3 examples I should say. And I'm not going to get into all the details and pros and cons of all the different types of body fillers. There's creamier ones, there's thicker ones, there's different colored hardeners you can use, and anyways, there's just a lot of them out there. I usually recommend, if you go to a jobber, your paint supply store, you can check with them, see what's popular in their area, what's their best seller, and you could try that out. Some body shops require a certain filler for their warranty, so they're going to maybe go with the higher price stuff. Some of your body shops that do a lot of used cars are probably going to go with the cheapest stuff. So it's up to you on how much money you want to spend. Again, you get what you pay for. Some of them is easier to sand, some of them clogs your paper easy. It just kind of really depends on, like I said, what your budget is. So you got your regular body filler. You have your kitty hair or fiberglass reinforced body filler. There's an aluminum filler as well. The aluminum one and this one are good for like the original factory leaded seam areas in the car. Again, check with the instructions on what they're capable of. The last one is the glazing putty. This is like a super creamy filler. It's great for deep scratches in your filler. just before you prime. It's good for fixing pinholes. It's really easy to spread. It's self-leveling. I have several different spreaders. I like these metal ones. This is my go-to one right here. You can see, I don't know how well you can see that, but it's been used quite a bit. I just clean it with a lacquer thinner and a rag. And then they have wide ones. You got plastic ones, different styles. Some people cut them down themselves and make their own custom ones. You know, you can play around with that experiment. There's a couple different Bondo boards or filler, mixing boards. This one's from Evercoat. I just kind of like it. It's well balanced. I just made one. I was playing with a plasma cutter one day. I made one out of metal. This one works really well too. However, it's just really heavy and it's hard on your wrist. So I really don't use that one very often anymore. There's also the other style that one of them is called onion board. There's other companies that make them as well, that you peel off the sheets. Those are really nice. I like those when I'm using this. But this stuff right here that I use is really thick. And what happens sometimes if you're not holding onto the page and you're spreading your Bondo, you're mixing your Bondo, sometimes the page will wrinkle, pull up with it. It's just kind of annoying. And then I also like to, as I'm mixing my Bondo, I like to wipe it off here and then go again. And with the Bondo, with the onion boards, you can't do that. So you wind up getting a bunch of filler up high on your mixer, where you can't really get that off of there and get it all mixed in. So that's the main reason why I don't use the tear-off style. But if you like that, hey, that's great. Everybody has their own methods and styles and preferences. So that's why they have so many different products out there for everybody to use and choose from. All right, so we talked about the filler over the bare steel. Now the filler over the epoxy. Now this is where it starts getting complicated if you're a weekend warrior. Okay, the epoxy primer, you can consult your TDS sheet. Some primers say you can put your body filler right over their epoxy primer without even sanding it for up to 1 week. This one, 3 days. So check your TDS sheet, it'll tell you. If you can get right on it, great. Do your body work and put your filler on there within a few days of spraying it. That's probably not practical for most of us, at least you guys that are watching this video. Because we're probably just like me, a weekend warrior. You have a few hours, maybe a couple hours during the week, and then maybe all day Saturday and a couple hours on Sunday. But family and work and everything else gets priority, and sometimes it might sit for a few weeks or a few months or maybe even years. So that's why I suggest epoxy priming the entire car first, and it's good to sit for a long time inside without having to worry about it. All right, so let's look at the scenario. You're working on your door. You stripped it down to bare metal. You put 2 coats of epoxy primer on it. The next day, primer's dry. You can go right on top of those door dings with your body filler without even sanding it. You sand your body filler, you're inevitably going to have breakthroughs in your primer. So that means you sanded off the primer, now you have bare steel maybe around where the dent was from your sanding block, because you're sanding the primer, or you're sanding the filler, and you're also knocking down some of the primer around the outside inevitably. So now what do? If your door is ready otherwise to put your primer surfacer down, you can actually get away with putting just some aerosol. Like I said, this is the same stuff that's in the can out of a gun, but you can go with an aerosol etch primer just on those little bare spots of metal, and then put your 2K primer surfacer on top of it. That'll prevent you from having to go through a whole priming session of epoxy if you're just doing a couple little spots on an otherwise ready to go door or panel. If you have a lot of areas, you have large areas all over the panel, you're probably best just go ahead and put another 2 coats of epoxy primer on it, and then immediately after that put your 2K primer surfacer. So if you have another scenario here, if you have a door that has no damage on it, lucky you, first of all. Secondly, You strip it down, put 2 coats of epoxy primer on it, and then immediately, well, same day, next day, whatever it is, follow your TDS sheets, it'll tell you. Put your 2 coats of epoxy primer on there, and then follow that up with your 2 coats of your 2K primer surfacer. Now that is the primer that you're going to be blocking for straightness, for panel flatness. It'll slight filler, so it fills in any sand scratches in your body filler. And chances are, after you block it, you'll probably do 2 more coats. So bare steel with 80, 2 coats of epoxy primer with a 1.4 tip gun, immediately followed by a 2K primer surfacer with a 1.8 tip on your gun, and then you start block sanding it. And I'll get into more detail on that later. So, like I said, this is where it gets complicated because depending on what you have on that panel, depends, like a flow chart, if this, then that, but if this, then that. So it just kind of depends on what you're doing, what the car is asking for. If you're a weekend warrior like me, and you have panels that sit for several weeks, it's outside the recoat window of your epoxy primer. So here's the next scenario. You have your door, you primed it with 2 coats of epoxy primer, and you let it sit for a couple weeks because you're working on other panels. You're working your way around the car, trying to get it all stripped and primed. Great. Now you want to go get into it and start doing body work. Well, you're not supposed to go with your body filler straight over the epoxy that's already been cured outside the recoat window. And again, that's, like I said, typically a week, depending on your primer. Check your TDS pages. So you're ready to start doing body work on the door, for example. So you have the door, you have some dents on it, maybe a little rusty area that you need to patch and fix, and you want to go ahead and finish it off and get it ready for paint, right? That's what we're trying to do. Depending on the product, some of them you can just go ahead and sand the repair area with 80 grit and then put your filler over there, over the top of it. Some will say you have to scuff it like with some Scotch-Brite, red Scotch-Brite, or a like 180 on a DA, and then you have to put another 2 coats of primer on it before you do anything on top of it. So it just kind of depends on the product that you're using. Now this one here, for example, says, and I quote, "This series of epoxy primers must be scuffed," must is capital, bold and underlined. Epoxy primer must be scuffed and reapplied if allowed to sit more than 3 days. How about that? That may be something to look into with the different products to see which one's going to work best for you. So what they're saying is, even though you already sprayed it with epoxy, two coats of epoxy, you must reapply it if you don't get it back into it for 3 days. So if you're a weekend warrior and it just seems like it's not very convenient to do that, because then you're spending your Saturday morning repriming, and then you're waiting for it to dry, so you spend half the day waiting for it to dry, and then by the time you get back to it, it's late in the evening, maybe the next day something came up, and then you work all week, and then you're back to it the following weekend, and you're starting all over again. So check the epoxy primer that you buy and see if it has that declaration. What I wound up doing with this, because this is what I used on the car, is my repair areas, I just sanded it all off in the repair area. So not the whole door, I just sanded the area that I'm working on. And then do my body filler over bare steel, and then scuff the whole panel, and then recoat the whole panel with epoxy. What that does is that recoats the whole panel. It covers up all of the bare areas that I sanded when I was blocking the body filler, and it's ready to go for the next step. So the next step after that is to put your 2K primer surfacer on there, because that would be the next step regardless, whether you're putting epoxy back on it or not. So to reiterate that scenario, bare steel sanded 80 grit scratch, 2 coats of epoxy primer. Say it dried for over a week. I sand the repair area down to bare metal, apply my body filler, scuff the entire surface panel, so basically scuff the entire panel, either with a red Scotch-Brite or I use 180 on a DA with an interface pad, and I'll show you that to you later here in a minute. And then recoat with 2 coats of epoxy primer again, and then 2 coats of 2K primer surfacer. So yes, you're spraying 2 different products, so you're cleaning your gun an extra time, but then your panel is ready to start blocking. You're ready to hang that door back on the car, aligning your gaps, and then blocking the whole side of the car. So if you're doing panel by panel, that's probably the best option. If your epoxy primer says you can put the body filler right on top of it, or your 2K primer surfacer right on top of it after the recoat window, if all you have to do is sand it, not have to respray your primer, then great. That's one less step that you have to do. So, but even if you sand a bare metal, 2 coats of epoxy primer, let it sit for a week or more, and sand the area for your body filler. Again, you're gonna want an 80 grit scratch, so most likely you're gonna be pulling off all the epoxy anyway. You're still gonna have bare metal, so you're still gonna wanna epoxy it again. So regardless, it's fine just doing it that way. However, that defeats the purpose or the ability to put your body filler on top of epoxy. Then you're going back to putting your filler on bare steel. But if you wanted to still put this back over the epoxy, sand the whole thing with 180 on an interface pad, put your 2 coats of epoxy primer on there, do your body filler on top of it without having to sand it, and then do your 2K primer surfacer. So just be mindful of your epoxy primer if it says with the recoat window on what you can do after the recoat window is expired, or as window is closed, I should say. So that's where it gets a little tricky with the epoxy. I hope that makes sense. Next up is your primer surfacers. All right, next up is the primer surfacers. I have both the Omni from PPG and the Limco from BASF. They're similar playing field as far as price and quality. So what is primer surfacer for? Well, just like the name implies, it's a primer and it's a surfacer. So it's for helping to level and fill any minor imperfections in your bodywork and the panel itself. So it's what you're block sanding. So you basically you're spraying it on and you're gonna just sand it right off, okay, when it comes down to it. But not all of it, right? Once you have your epoxy sprayed and prepped and ready to go to the next step of the primer surfacer, you'll want to spray this stuff with a 1.8 tip as recommended. But again, check your TDS sheet for the product that you're spraying. It's a little thicker, it's going to go on a little heavier. I'm not going to go into all the painting techniques as far as like gun control and overlap and patterns and all that kind of stuff. That'll be maybe for another video. You've heard of block sanding just before paint. This is what you're sanding off. You're sanding the primer surfacer. So once you're ready to spray your primer surfacer, you want to do 2 coats of this on there at least. But again, check your TDS sheets. It'll tell you what you can do, what you can get away with. It may say 3 coats. Just kind of depends, and follow the instructions as far as like how soon you do your 2nd coat, how soon you do your 3rd coat. You know, it'll tell you medium wet, heavy, whatever, light, whatever the case may be. So just follow those instructions for your particular brand, and they should steer you in the right direction. If you're spraying this on top of something, whatever it is, it should be sanded with maybe like a 120, 180, unless you're fresh epoxy. So if you just sprayed epoxy in the morning, it's in a couple hours later in the evening or maybe the next day, you can spray this right over the top of your epoxy without sanding your epoxy primer. If your epoxy primer, like I said in the last section, if you're spraying your epoxy primer and it's going to be weeks later, depending on your epoxy primer, you may need to sand it or scuff it with a red Scotch-Brite and then reapply your epoxy primer 1 or 2 coats. Or depending on your epoxy primer, you may be able to just scuff it or sand it with 120 and then spray your primer surfacer over the top of it. Again, that's where it gets complicated with the epoxy primer. It's confusing because It depends on the epoxy brand on what they want you to do to make sure that you have good adhesion. Okay, so when you're ready to block sand your 2K primer surfacer, probably start with like a 180. That'll help knock it down fairly quick, so you'll actually burn through a lot of material, but you'll get it nice and flat. And then after the 180, you can go with a 220, and then maybe a 320 or 400. And then from there, depends on what you're gonna do. If you're gonna put a sealer on there, you can stop at the 400, spray your sealer, then go to your base coat and your clear coat on top of that. If you're going with a high metallic, you can go with like up to like 600 maybe, and then put your sealer, base coat and clear coat on there. If you're not using a sealer, I would definitely go to at least 600, especially if it's a high metallic, and maybe even an 800, and then put your metallic base coat and then your clear coat on top of it. So again, check your TDS sheets. It'll tell you exactly what your base coat needs to go on top of. So, but we're not going to get that far into it in this video. I just wanted to get to the undercoats, which is your primers and sealers. All right, let's talk about sandpaper real quick here. There's a lot of different grades of sandpaper, a lot of different grit, different quality, different shapes and sizes. I'm not going to get too in depth with all of this, but just kind of give you an overview of what to look for and what's out there. But first, let's go ahead and go through each of the grits at each stage again. When you're stripping the paint to bare metal, you'll want to go with a 36 grit. It's nice and coarse. It'll chew up the paint, spit it out, and it'll last fairly long. We have 80 grit, which is what you'll want to finish the metal off with. So you want to do the last bit of stripping and condition the surface of the metal, put it with 80 grit, put that 80 grit scratch tooth in there for your primer to stick to, or your body filler to stick to, okay? And then after you spray your epoxy primer, if you need to go back over it again, you can go over it with a 180 or maybe even a 120. I don't have a 120 here, I have a 180. And then on an interface pad, I'll add that because I haven't talked about that yet. So what this does is this gives it a little cushion, which is why I like another reason why I like the hook and loop or the Velcro style. So what this does is allows you, it's all squishy, so it'll allow you to prepare the surface or condition the surface to whatever grit paper you have on there without digging in and making grooves in the primer, as light as it might be. This will follow the contours of your panel, like I said, without digging into your primer. So if you're just prepping it to refinish and not doing any contouring, you'll want to use an interface pad. You can start your body filler. This is 40 grit. It's really coarse. Again, get the most basic contour of your body filler into shape before you get it completely leveled out. You can switch to an 80 grit to get most of the 40 grit scratches off of it and kind of get closest to your contour. And then you can switch to, I don't have it here, but I have some 120. Finish your body filler off with 120. One thing I didn't mention before is guide coat. Now you'll want to use guide coat when you're block sanding your primer, but also when you're doing your mud work. So when you're sanding your Bondo, put your guide coat on there, and you'll be able to see all the sand scratches will literally just jump out at you. Sand your Bondo with your 40 grit. Go ahead and brush it off or blow it off, and then put your guide coat on there. And then you take out all of the 40 scratches with your 80. Blow it off, wipe it off. Put guide coat it again, and then go over it with your 120. And you'll find that it's like super smooth, but it's still got some grit because it's only a 120 sand scratch, but it'll be perfectly ready to accept your primer surfacer or your second application of epoxy and then your primer surfacer on top of that. So guide coat is definitely your friend. I use this stuff right here. It's from Mirka. I got this off of Amazon. I'll put a link down in the description below. Same with this other paper. I've been using this Duragold 6-inch DA hook and loop paper. This has actually been working pretty well. I have several different grits here. I'll put links to the description for all those as well. Different types, like I mentioned before, I showed you before, the sticky back versus the Velcro. I'm phasing out of the sticky back until I'm done using what I have left of that. Everything is going to Velcro because, like I said before, if you put your Velcro on there, for example, I have some 80 grit right here, and I'm doing one panel. I can sand it with my 80. If it's still good, I can put it aside. It doesn't matter if it gets dusty or not, because it's not going to ruin the Velcro. You know, if it's sticky back, it's just going to stick to something and get all nasty and you can't use it again. And then maybe I'll go to the 220 because I'm on a different stage, on a different panel. But I'm on an interface pad here. See if it's crooked, just peel it off, put it back on again. Boom, there you go. I can use this for a little bit. Oh, the pad's still good, or that paper's still good. I'll set that aside for now. I'm going to go back to my 80 and do my other door. You know, you're not wasting paper. You're able to use it all up and not have to waste it because it won't stick anymore. They have the same kind of thing with these as well. This is sticky back, but I use these Durablocks. Now, I really like these. They're really lightweight, and I've been using these for a long time. But it's personal preference. Some people hate these. I don't know why. Yeah, everybody has their own opinion, and there's lots of different blocks out there. So you can experiment and with what's out there and find out what works for you. I mean, even one of these little old-fashioned hardware store wood sanding blocks work too. This works fine with the sticky back, or if you don't have a sticky back like this one right here, you can put it in there, but then it cuts holes in there, and then you're actually wasting that much on each side because it has to fold around and connect to those little nails. Then you can cut them down, make custom blocks. But you're going to want a variety. There's a narrow square block and a round block to get into fender contours, short blocks, long blocks. I have this one that I tried out. This is an old one. I don't like the style that uses these clamps because it puts tension on the flat part here. And I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but it's actually bowing out from the tension on these springs. And then actually I have a bump here and a bump here where these handles connect. So this thing's garbage. I'm gonna throw it away. I also have some of these. I have a couple different styles of these as well. It's nice ergonomic. It's also super light. This one's from Norton, and it's got the Velcro. So I can't use this style on there, but I can still use these. That still works. And so yeah, these work pretty good too. I like those as well, because you can get this in just like this, where there's nothing on there. You can get it with a sticky back, or you can get it with the hook and loop. So it just kind of depends on what system you want to go with. For the DA, I recommend hook and loop, and depending on what sanding blocks you use, the sticky back is probably going to be the way to go for your long rolls like this. So a couple other blocks that I have. These are good for wet sanding, and so is this one right here. This one's soft and softer. So it's got soft and softer on there, where this one's just kind of stiff. This is basically like this one, but just flat. You can wrap your paper around it, your wet paper on there, and go to town. So that leads me to one last thing with the sandpaper is wet sanding versus dry sanding. So depending on what you're doing, if I'm working on my top coats, like my clear coat, I'm getting ready to cut and buff, I'll wet sand it, no question there. And as far as like primer and stuff, you can guide coat and block sand your primer with wet paper, or you can do it dry. It's just personal preference, really. I've done it both ways. I think they both work adequately. I do like the wet sanding, but I don't like the mess. Because you have to have constant flow of water. Your feet are wet. It's just a messy job. I mean, you can't deny the results are good. But you know, you can do just as well with dry sanding too. It's just, again, it comes down to personal preference on what you're doing. If I'm doing like a high metallic, I might consider wet sanding, and the grits that you use to wet sand to that point are different too, depending on whether you're wet sanding, dry sanding, what kind of paint you're using. So again, check with your technical data sheet, your TDS sheets, and it'll tell you what it recommends for wet sanding or dry sanding, and what grits to use, because it'll be different numbers sometimes. All right, so we're almost ready to wrap this up, but I wanted to show you a couple more things. Just some miscellaneous tools that I recommend that maybe you don't think of until you're like, hey, I need that. So, well, first off is this little guy right here. This is just a can opener from Ace. This one's from Ace Hardware, but it's made for opening paint cans. It's just got the leverage the way it's made, makes it opening the can really easy, and you just hang it on a little hook. Probably have one of these in your junk drawer. This is just a spreader. I use this for scooping the Bondo out. Just get yourself an assortment of Bondo spreaders, different sizes. They usually have a pack of different sizes, plastic and metal. Just get a couple of them, find out which ones you like best. You'll want a good gun cleaning kit. Honestly, I only use really these two right here. You do not want to use anything metal brush-wise in your gun. You don't want to do that. So get yourself a little kit, or at least a couple little items there to clean your gun with. The pump and spray bottles, I like these a lot for the wax and grease remover. And when you go shopping for one of these, make sure it is rated for solvent. Otherwise, your O-rings will just stop working and the whole thing will just go to waste. You'll want to get some mixing cups. You can get these from the home improvement stores, or you can get them from your jobber. You can buy them online. Just look and make sure it has the ratio that you're going to use for your paint line. This has most of them on there. They have small ones. They have this size. They have them in a half-gallon pitcher or even a gallon jug. But I like this size right here because it basically will fill up my cup. So I'll use them over and over again. I'll wash them out with the lacquer thinner when I'm cleaning my gun, and just wipe them out with a paper towel, and then set them aside. Once I can't read it anymore, or it's too yucky, or I didn't get back to cleaning it right away, then I'll just use it as a parts cup, throw nuts and bolts in there when I need something to hold on to stuff. Speaking of that, here is the cup that comes with the disposable cup system, originally made by 3M. This is the Harbor Freight knockoff, but I actually saw that they sell these online on Amazon, so I'll put a link down in the description below as well. They have this size, they have the larger size, and then they also have the smaller one like I showed you earlier online, so go check those out. And then a squirt bottle here for your lacquer thinner or acetone for cleaning your paint guns and your Bondo spreaders and Bondo boards. Make sure it is solvent rated as well, otherwise it just starts turning to mush, and yeah, it's obviously not going to work. So you can get this from your jobber as well, and make sure that it's safe to use with your solvents. And then last but certainly not least is the guide coat. I know I mentioned this earlier, but I can't stress enough, how important this stuff is, especially when you're doing your Bondo work, because you don't want to leave any surprise sand scratches in your body filler, expecting your surfacer to try to fill in big old canyons of sand scratches in there. So that's some of the items that I could think of off the top of my head that you might need. All right, last but certainly not least is PPE. So oftentimes I see people wearing the wrong mask for different operations. If you're just sanding just a little bit, put a mask on. If you're spraying paint, put the right mask on, okay? What I mean by that is these little basic face masks here are for light sanding, okay? So if you're just doing some block sanding, you're just sanding some Bondo, maybe you're stripping the car outside, those will probably be sufficient. I like these N95s. I think you've heard of those in the last few years. This particular one has a vent on it an exhaust vent, so when you breathe out, it comes out the front. For me, that's beneficial because I wear glasses, and what happens is if it doesn't have that, my glasses get all fogged up. These are a little bit more expensive, but definitely worth saving your health. If you have a 3M mask like this with exchangeable filters, these pink filters here are also for sanding dust. So I see people painting their car in a paint booth even using these. This is not for painting. It's only for dust particles. You'll need a organic vapor cartridge respirator. Not a gas mask, it's a respirator. So this one is from 3M. It has, like I just showed you, it has changeable cartridges, so you can replace these and just reuse the mask over and over again. And you can actually extend the life of these things by putting it in a Ziploc bag. Most of these come with a Ziploc bag, as a package. So you throw it back in there, zip it up. What I usually do is I usually have like 2 sandwich bags that I put one of these in each one of them, and then throw all 3 pieces in a gallon Ziploc bag. And then I just got this one also from SAS Corp. It's just a little bit less expensive, but it's also an organic vapor cartridge. 3M, you're paying for the name. It's NIOSH approved product. This is also safe to use when you're painting with catalyzed paints. I'm trying this one out only because I have a hard time with this thing sealing around my nose, maybe because of my glasses. But after you're painting, if you're seeing the color of the paint up inside around your mask, that tells you that the paint is getting in there. So it's not doing its job. If you have any facial hair at all where the mask is supposed to be sealing against your skin, you're fooling yourself if you think you're protecting yourself by wearing the mask, because the air is going to go in the place of least resistance. Unless your beard is filtering the isocyanates, it's not working for you correctly. So I see a lot of guys wear these masks over their full beards, and it does probably cut down on it a little bit, but if you can smell it, then it's getting in your lungs. So just keep that in mind if you're not clean shaven, or keep your goatee really tight and small, or if your mask isn't big to fit over the whole thing, then it's not 100% working for you. So I'm trying to try this and see if that fits a little bit better than the 3M for me. Sometimes you need to just crank them as tight as you can and shave, unfortunately, for it to actually work right. All right, so that's it for the PPE on this. Basically, dust filters for sanding, a charcoal cartridge, organic vapor cartridge, respirator for spraying your paints and primers. You want some good gloves, possibly some eye protection, some goggles, or at least some safety glasses. So keep yourself safe. Thanks for watching. Hope this helped somebody out. I did put links down in the description for as much of this stuff as I could find on Amazon. Hopefully help you find the products a little easier. I'm not sponsored by any of these people. It's just stuff that I use around the shop here. I thought I'd share it with you. And if you have any questions, like I said, just go ahead and leave them down in the comment below. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.